good to go? All right, we'll call this meeting to order. Welcome, everyone. Mr. Shivers, can we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Heckler. Commissioner Leeson.
Here.
Commissioner Lewis. Commissioner Long.
Here.
Commissioner McLaren.
Here.
Commissioner McVeigh. Commissioner Stewart. Commissioner Chairman Tetrick.
Here.
Commissioner Watson.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to item number 2, approval of the minutes from the last meeting. Has everyone had a chance to review them, and do you have any questions, concerns, clarifications?
I had one item under continued discussion on zoning regulations updates. The third bullet point down, second sentence says the commission agreed to move forward, yada yada. I think we discussed it, but I don't think we actually agreed on anything yet.
Well, excuse me if I'm speaking out of turn, but I think what I was trying to say is that we discussed to move it forward to this meeting, which is what we did, right?
And to be fair, I probably should have put that on all of them, just because that was my intent, was just to say that we're not formally adopting this, agreeing to continue discussion. If that helps, or maybe I need to put that we agreed to continue discussion, maybe.
It doesn't matter to me, I just wanted to point that out, that I didn't think that
can
was
do it either way.
worded quite right, but.
I mean, because, you know, that is on the agenda to talk about tonight, so we did move it forward, but I guess however we need to change the wordage, you know, to make that right, I guess.
So should I just strike that? We'll just say we just discussed, okay. No problem.
Any other questions? Awesome. Do we have a motion for approval?
I so move. I second.
With the second, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to item number 3, new business. Mr. Shivers, would you introduce that, please?
I'm actually going to defer to Mr. Rickard here and pull that up here. Yeah. Of course, the plat is really much too big for our screen, so we'll start with a portion and move it as needed.
And Jay will try to help us if you got any specific areas you want to look at. This is a plat for Prairie Trails Edition, and what this is the property that contains a golf course. The city of El Dorado was approached by a company to purchase the golf course from the city. The city purchased that golf course a number of years ago, and the city commission has agreed to proceed with the sale of the golf course. We suggested that it's probably a good idea to get that platted, just so we have one record document that shows easements. There's been enhancements on the golf course over the years, from bike paths to, you know, city infrastructure utilities, that we wanted to be assured that we're all contained within easements, so we wouldn't limit public access to any areas through and across the golf course, or any ability to tie into that city infrastructure. So really, this is the cleanest way to do this. The boundary is not changing. It is as it exists today. One thing to point out, this does include an official right-of-way for Country Club Lane. Country Club Lane has existed as private property, just an access across since its inception. So that does clean this up and make that Country Club Lane a public right-of-way. As well, as I mentioned prior, ensuring that the bike paths are still accessible to all of the public.
Does anyone have any questions for Scott?
The lane you're talking about is the entrance into the country club.
Correct, off Country Club Road. Country Club Lane will be platted as right-of-way.
Oh, okay.
You'll show it. It's the area on there that is the little boulder line type right across there.
Runs east and west.
Correct.
So there wasn't anything there before?
No.
The city had?
No.
And of course, before it was public property, so it wasn't a concern.
And Roger Cutzinger from Savoy is here tonight. They are the one that performed the plat and survey for the city of El Dorado.
Any other questions?
I have no questions.
Did you want to speak? Roger, you good?
The only question I have, Roger Cutzinger, Savoy Company. The only question that I know that came about was from Mr. Mealy, who's the third property from the left. And yesterday I had Casey Jackson in my office for a while, and he was representing him. And I took a picture of this and gave it to him, and he sent it on to Mr. Mealy, who couldn't be here tonight. And he seemed to be okay with it, because I explained to him that the line we have on the north side of Country Club Lane are not a perfectly straight line, because we stayed with the monumented lines of each of those 4 properties. And that puts all of the utilities then over onto the Country Club Lane side. And so he seemed to be happy with it. I heard no complaints anyway. So we've got 62 courses on the west side and 18 on the east side of the railroad, so that's quite a plat.
Yeah.
And we tried to cover the easements. Jay, if you'll slide up to the north there, there was a piece of bike path up there that Scott had asked us to cover with an easement right opposite there to the left of where it says Corps of Engineers. That area is on page 2. We described that as a new easement to connect the east with the west. And then clear down on the south end, down by 12th Avenue, there's another one there. It says see page 2, and that also dealt with the bike path. So we can connect all that up. We tried to show all the easements, all of the utilities. We called one call, and best we know, that's the way it is.
Thank you. Well, there's no further discussion. Do we have a motion for approval?
I move to approve the final plat of Parade Trails Edition as presented.
A second.
We have a second. Thank you. Mr. Shivers, can we have a roll call?
Commissioner Beeson,
Yes.
Commissioner Long,
Yes.
Commissioner McLaren,
Yes.
Chairman Tetrick,
Yes.
Commissioner Watson.
Yes.
The motion passes 5-0.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Okay, I sit down all day, so I'm gonna stand up here.
Okay.
That's all right.
Okay, we'll move on to item number 4, old business. That's yours.
Okay, so the last couple meetings, back in November, the city commission asked us to begin reviewing some of our regulations as they relate to accessory structures and tiny homes. So in November, we had a work session, had some pizza, we looked over, identified some of the problems we had and some potential ways to fix those problems. And in December, we met again, and we discussed some more of those options and paths forward. And so that leads us to tonight. We left off our last meeting. I think we decided as a group to look at how the ordinance language might look, as well as looking at a few more examples. The city commission is also anxious to see what we're discussing, and so they've asked Scott and I to brief them on this in mid-February, which is before our next meeting. So what I've done is I've given you guys 3 packets. One has a sample ordinance language. It's a working document. It's been tweaked and changed a dozen times already, and it's certainly not final. You'll also have a PowerPoint that I'm going to walk you through that just kind of helps explain what we're looking at, and then an extra ordinance example that we'll talk about as well. So I'd like to put it to you guys. We can go through all the ordinance language and examples and have an informal vote on what parts we agree need to be changed and move forward with it. Or we can go section by section, discuss the potential change, decide if it's something that we want to continue to work on, or we can decide that maybe we have adequate rules in place to address that concern, and then we don't need to waste time talking about it forever. Just so this also gives us the ability to focus on what we need to focus on, and also tell the city commission what we're doing and where we're going next couple weeks. So the first section I have here on page 1 is probably the most simple change. City commission did not ask us for this, but I would tacked it on since we're working on it. We discussed amending our bylaws to have a chairman, a vice chairman, and a new position, which is just the Board of Zoning Appeals representative. The ordinance language is really quite minor. It just says that once a year, when we re-elect or elect a new chairman and vice chairman, we will appoint an appeals representative who will sit on the board and attend those meetings, which occur about once or twice a year. And then after that, the next planning commission, that person can just briefly share with us what happened. And those meetings are sometimes just once a year. So we've got the language in there. Like I said, that one's pretty simple and straightforward. So do you guys?
Excuse me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Number 3, who's our secretary? Are you the secretary?
Yeah,
Okay.
you don't have to vote on me every year.
Okay. Okay, good.
So, and to back up to before I even start on this, do you guys want to review all of this, or should we just go section by section and agree if it's something we want to keep working on?
I kind of think we should go section by section, and if we think it's something that's good, vote on it, and see if we can move on from it.
All right, that sounds great to me. The first section is the only one I don't have supplemental materials on, since it's a simple one. So is this is this a bylaw that you guys are interested in proceeding with?
Which part was that?
Oh, sorry, the bylaw to add the representative.
Are you wanting discussion?
Oh, I'm sorry.
vote,
So
or what?
I'm just looking for some informal vote or feedback. If you guys think it's a great idea, then, then we'll keep this on our list to change. And if we don't need it, then now's the time that we'll just strike it from the list and we're not gonna worry about it.
Well, I think part 1 is written well and should be as is.
Okay.
So
Was there somebody asking about getting the planning commission member on that board, or
Nope.
what brought this up?
It was my own idea, and honestly, the Board of Zoning Appeals, sometimes it's hard to just have, just keep the seats filled. And I thought that at the same time, since you guys meet a lot more frequently and you're much more familiar with the ordinances than, say, the board members on a board that meets once a year, I thought it'd be a good addition as far as the discussion goes. So that certain topics, one of you guys could say, well, we see this in planning commission, and, so I thought it'd be a good addition. It's very similar topics that are covered. So,
I agree, something we should move forward with.
we all agree on that one, Kyle?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right, so the next section is where we get into our accessory structures, which is broken into 3 subsections there. So we'll just look at the first one. So take a moment just to read how I've written it out. Like I said, it's not final, but it's just a draft. We would be removing the red with the cross out and adding in the yellow highlighted spots. And I'll go over it in a minute with you.
Can we ask a question?
Yeah, and I just want to focus on the first bullet point, just number 1.
Okay, number 1,
Yes.
facade of the principal structure, that's fairly general.
Yes, and so the way we talked about that part as far as a route to get to 1,500 square feet, we were just thinking your house is siding, has the front of your detached garage siding. That's what it's, so match the material. You have a brick house, have the side that's available or viewable from the road or park or whatever is public property nearby to be brick.
I guess how many of how many properties would fit inside that criteria for the 1,500 square feet? You know, how deep is a typical lot? You know, if they have to be 60 foot back, I mean, how much does that?
We have a lot that are about 120 feet deep. That's a pretty common one. The newer lots are a little bit bigger, get up as about 150-ish feet. Just kind of depends when it was platted. The truth that, if you guys can remember back in November, I put a table up here to show you what our most commonly asked for special use permit detached garages. That's a mouthful. And the most common asked for is 1,500 square feet. And I know I'm more familiar with this because I deal with it all the time, is they go on big lots. A lot of people just don't have room for them. So part of this is that's the most commonly asked for ones. We just wanted to give a route to those people to get that without a special use permit. All of those people had very large lots. I remember one up on Random Road had a 300-foot deep lot, and you can't see his accessory structure from the back, or the front, I mean.
Yeah, I knew he was building it, and I still couldn't see it.
Right, I drove by it the other day and I couldn't see it.
Couldn't see it, yeah.
Yeah. And so the point of this is, one, is to keep, whenever you have since we're getting more tiny homes, to keep a tiny home 450 square feet from having a 1,200 square foot garage next to it. That's a massive garage next to a tiny, tiny home. And at the same time, we're wanting to make it a little bit easier for people to build bigger buildings. And at the very least, you still have the special use permit process. So in the PowerPoint packet I gave you guys, and I have it on the screens, I had made a rough graph to kind of take a peek at it with a couple examples. So we're going by gross floor area, which is what's enclosed. So that's your garage, your living room, your bedrooms, everything like that. Does not include your porches. So for example, I have A on here in the bottom. If this were a person that had a 550 square foot home on the tiny home scale range, with the 1-to-1 ratio, they'd be allowed to build a 550 square foot detached garage. Or if they wanted to go larger, it'd be a special use permit. So a second little example I have is B up there in the middle by the orange. B, we could say, is someone with a 1,400 square foot home. That includes their garage, living spaces, which is pretty common in El Dorado. So by these rules, with the 1-to-1 ratio, they could build a 1,200 square foot garage by right. They could build up to 1,400 square foot with the two conditions, with the front facade and the setback, or they can ask for a special use permit. And C at the top, 2,200 square foot home. They can build a 1,200 square foot accessory structure by right, a 1,500 square foot structure with the conditions by right, or ask for a special use permit for something larger. So I tried to do a visual breakdown of how this might work. And it is a little bit different than what we have. Our current rules right now are just a flat 1,200 square feet. If you have the space, you can build up to 1,200 square feet. Anything beyond that's a special use permit. So the highlight is that this would help us a little bit with large garages next to tiny homes, which we know are slowly coming in. Gives an avenue for people to get a larger one up to 1,500 square feet, but also preserves the ability to ask for a special use permit. If it's a 5-acre lot on the edge of town, and they want to do that 1,500 square foot one, but says, hey, I really don't need to put brick on the front, no one's going to see it, come ask for a special use permit. You know, if it makes sense, then you guys are a very logical board, so. That's how that rule would work. So the question is, is this something we want to move forward with? If it is, then there's always room for improvement so we can further refine the language or how it works. If it's not, and we want to keep what we have in place right now, which is the flat 1,200 square feet, that's fine too. We've been tasked with reviewing all of these things, so these are just some other options we have.
I think it's pretty good. You give a lot more options to people up to the 1,500, square feet or whatever they didn't have before. I think that, you still keep the facade and that stuff in there that would somewhat make it look like the house. I think that number 1 is written pretty well.
Okay.
I like the portions that increase flexibility, but I don't really like the 1-to-1 for smaller homes. And I don't like having to match the facade, but that's just my opinion. You don't need a unanimous vote or anything, but.
This is very informal. This is just a group decision. There's no formal votes. We're not adopting anything tonight, so. It's just, if we all agree that maybe we drop the 1-to-1 ratio, then that's something we do, or if we want to change the facade, I wish we had a few more members here, but to get the full board weighing in, but Gerald, Brad, what do you guys think about this one? I'm putting you on the spot.
Well, I'm comfortable with the way it's written. I mean, I like the 1-to-1 ratio facade. A facade meaning, I think, too, building materials, color.
And if we need to change that word, we can do that.
I
That's
think
fine.
that'd probably be a good idea, cause it is, I mean, there's a lot of,
Fairly generic.
Okay.
you could get, fake brick, I mean, it would.
We could figure out a better word, maybe building materials, matching
I
building
think
materials.
building materials would be
Okay.
good.
Okay,
And that's only on one side, I mean,
On the
huge
front.
expense.
talking the front, right?
So I'm hoping with the visible from public property, sometimes we have corner lots, so you're gonna have two sides visible. Sometimes we have public parks too, that would apply to. So if your house is in front of a park, then, you might have more of a demand on what you make look nice. Gerald, Scott, are you guys leaning one way or the other?
I'm pretty much in agreement with it all. It just seems like if you add the special use permit on some of this, it just says, okay, you can have your small house and your big building, you just gotta get a special permit, which defeats the purpose.
And I'm also worried about someone asking for a large garage and then saying, well, as a technicality, I'll put my tiny home next to it so I can get my big workshop. We've already had talks like that from residents, so.
I've heard that quite often. I'll build this big old shop and build a loft over here, and that'll be my home, but
Right. Okay, well then we will, I'll make a
I
note on
mean,
the,
if you've got the area and you're willing to do the facade and make it all look uniform throughout the property, for example, mine is a 90 by 300. I could hide a building, a real big one in the back of it, and most people would never know it was there.
yeah.
But
And that'd be a great example for the special use permit is, I have this big building and no one's gonna see it. So,
a lot of times in town where you've got easements and people living behind you, even with a big piece of property, you may be blocking the morning sun from this person's yard.
the truth is 90% of lots can't build a large building. The ones that we're gonna see are the ones who bought a lot next to them. Like South Emporia is an example, we have plenty of spots with open lots and people's, it's an opportunity to build another garage or a bigger parking area. So that's where we'll see these bigger ones come in to play.
I guess then I have another question. It says 1-to-1 ratio of the gross floor area. What if there isn't a house on their lot? Cause isn't theirs two separate lots?
That we consider it one, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they actually, wasn't they joining the lots and
We're working on
where it
some,
couldn't be separated?
we're working on some of our own internal policies to guarantee the way those stick together.
Well, cause I mean,
Yeah.
that's one that you could.
That's a whole nother topic, really.
Cause then there is no limit,
Yeah.
other than if it's zero, I mean.
Well, and the ordinance, the way it's worded is that you're allowed a detached garage. Because we had an idea thrown at us, well, what if I built a 1,200 square foot garage, and then another, and then another? Like, uh-oh. So you're allowed A. And now the way the rules are allowed, you can still build your up to 200 square foot storage buildings. You can have a few of those. There's no limitation on those as long as they meet the rules. But as far as the large structures like a garage, you're limited.
I think it just gives a lot more options without needing a special use permit. I think
Okay.
it'd make the process easier, honestly.
Then let's hop to number 2. We have, the current rules say that your limit is 12 feet in height at the sidewall measurement. And we, at our first or second meeting, I brought up the idea of another popular rule that some cities are doing this, the height is the peak of their principal structure, or 25 feet, whichever is smaller. At the last meeting, and David Stewart's not here, he had also brought up the point of doing it to a midpoint of the principal structure roof. There's pros and cons to each of them. There's 3 different options. I don't believe that I have a preference, but kind of, one is I guess maybe for us to think is, do we want to keep it as it is today? And if we want to change it, which of the 2 are we leaning towards? So they all have their own pros and cons. That's what it comes down to.
Is this the way it is today?
The 12 feet at the sidewall.
That's the only limit we have, is the
This is a
sidewalk?
suggestion change.
Yes.
Between the two.
Oh, okay.
Right now, we have 12-foot sidewall.
Yeah, it mentions the 12 feet in the red
Yeah.
crossed out area there.
Yeah.
So if you did have a steep pitch, you could theoretically have a very tall building. But we've also issued special use permits for buildings exceeding 12 feet in height. that's another avenue that the special use permit does.
So are we not gonna limit the sidewall height as part of this now for just putting the 25 feet? Is that right, or do we wanna put something in?
That would, if we chose that one, the way that we've discussed it would change it to where we're not regulating the sidewall, but measuring it by the peak. But we could do both. I mean, this one is really up in the air to me. I mean, it's 3 options, they're all good options. So,
I mean, you know, it seems that the 12 feet is kinda right on the edge for most of your campers, and, you know,
yes,
what does 1 or 2 feet hurt if you don't exceed your overall height?
right. And we have had a lot of feedback for, you know, my travel trailer is 12 feet. I really need an extra foot to get it on. Some people will take it in the end walls, put their garage doors down there. So, you know, that would benefit, either of the other two would benefit those people with tall vehicles or boats. And then on the flip side, then you could potentially also have a very tall sidewall. So it's all give and take with these 3.
Well, I think last time, Kyle even mentioned we're getting kind of complicated in a few of these, and we want to keep it as simple for this group as
Yep.
well as our city patrons to understand, and 1 number is probably easier to understand than 2 or 3.
Sure. And the more complicated it gets, the more we're also asking from applicants, you know, if, you know, and personally I was concerned when David Stewart had mentioned the midpoint, because I'm sitting there thinking in my head, how do we ask them to measure the midpoint for sure, and then do we have to go out and measure and confirm it? So we can leave it at the sidewall measurement, that's fine. You know,
What if you also regulated the slope? That would, if you raise the sidewall, why couldn't you lower the slope? Make a regulation, that'd keep the height from going on up,
we can place a limit on that.
you know?
Yeah.
412.
What if they wanted to build a Quonset?
We're gonna cross that bridge when we come to it.
I'm
Like
sorry.
Kyle's asked about that, and I just don't have the right answer for that
I'm
structure.
sorry, I didn't hear what Scott said.
What if they wanted to build a Quonset?
Oh.
A 25-foot tall Quonset would be a pretty wide building.
Wouldn't it exceed their square footage though? To get that way? I think it would. We're gonna say it would.
Yeah, I personally don't think you wanna get into slopes, but that's just my opinion.
And
That-
slopes
that's-
could be hard to regulate too.
I would
I
agree.
agree with that.
I would
think-
agree.
I think we'd open a whole nother can of
I'm
worms.
comfortable with 25 feet center peak.
I think that's a good number, but I'm concerned about what your sidewall heights would get into.
But that's the max. It still can't be taller than the house roof, right? So if you got a single-story house,
Right,
it's like that picture shows, it's probably
Yeah.
only gonna be about 17 feet
yep.
to the peak.
And where do we get 25 feet? Is that a random number? Is that something,
That's actually that line is pretty common that I've seen with other cities using.
that's a common height,
Yeah, every city is doing this a little bit differently, but I've seen that one more commonly.
25?
Yeah, when we do this, we like to look at and see what other cities are doing, see what works.
Okay, good, that's,
I'm good
Okay.
with the 25 feet.
It also
If
keeps
it's
you
surface lesser.
from, you know, having a garage as tall as your 3-story house or something.
if you've done some research about what other cities are doing, and that's a pretty common number, then I'm okay with that.
And that's pretty common with cities, is sometimes one city gets ahead with a good rule and other cities start copying it, and if it works well. All right, so then, do we think we want to keep the peak of the principal structure or 25 feet, whichever is lesser?
Yes.
Kyle, you,
I'm not sure. I mean, in some cases, it's gonna give them more flexibility. If they wanna put that tall RV in there, they can build a smaller footprint with a taller roof.
yeah.
I'm fine with that one. I
Okay.
have it amended.
I think that this is the option that will also keep us from reviewing a few more special use permits. Since all these have in common is a lot of people ask for 1,500 square feet, and a lot of them are also asking for 14 feet at the sidewall to get their vehicles in.
That's a good point.
And then the third point on this one, we don't really need to review, it just says that anything larger can be done by special use permit. Now, do we need to take a moment, because I mean, we still have some stuff to cover.
No, well. Yeah, keep going, you're fine.
All right, so at the top of page 3, if you guys want to take a moment to read about the shipping containers, and then I will talk some more on that.
If it's temporary, why on a hard surface?
So we don't have big trucks driving through yards, tearing stuff up. Our code enforcement has nuisance codes already to keep people from driving through yards, putting trash on yards and stuff like that. So we would rather it all be on hard surface, just like a car.
And if you've ever been on a job site and used one of them that's sitting in the dirt, yeah, it's a mess.
So we it's not allowed now to park one of these on city streets or in an alley legally?
No.
You cannot do that.
There are certain circumstances where dumpsters or a container for construction could be allowed and permitted to sit there for a short duration of time. But, like, take a building downtown that's going through a remodel, there is no property there other than public right-of-way, so.
Right. But in a residential area,
No.
I mean, we don't want these containers sitting out on the street for
Streets, no.
60 days
Or
or 90 days.
In the right-of-way, blocking sidewalks or things
Right.
like that.
Okay, so I just wanted to clarify that. 'cause-
No problem. And actually, I'll talk some more on this. Last month, I brought this up about prohibiting this. Since it's a newer issue that cities are dealing with, almost every city is at least talking about this if they haven't passed something. And so I actually wrote this earlier in the month to allow temporary use and not permanent usage. And then somewhere in the last week, in part of my research, I found a lovely ordinance from a small town on the Texas coast who's been dealing with this longer than us. And instead of prohibiting them, they actually put a list of 9 criteria on there. And I spoke with Kelly earlier today, and I mentioned it to him, and he said, hey, let's consider that as an alternative. So we have, what I wrote would be the permanent ban as well as a temporary storage, and then you also have an ordinance packet I gave you. So on page 2 of that, I highlighted these 9 criteria that are worth looking at for just a moment. Basically, it says you can have in residential areas, but this city chooses to regulate where you can have them by lot size, regulates number of containers, stacking, location, screening, habitation, storage. So if we don't want to prohibit them, there's some other things that we can look at, maybe the points of it that we want to be careful on.
Do you have to have a permit to set one of these on your property? Do they have to come, like, you have to okay where it's set or how it's set?
We haven't permitted any, and we haven't given permission or permitted any. We have given temporary permission for like pods.
Okay.
Scott and I have had people come in with the pods when they're moving, they
Okay.
put the pod in their driveway for like a week. And so those have just been verbally like, okay, that's fine.
Okay, you have 60 days and it has to be moved or,
In most cases, we don't have that regulation in place,
oh,
so this would be the first.
okay.
Yeah. And so, since we haven't, we want to be lenient, so we've said, sure, you can put it there, just make sure, it's not a permanent thing. We understand you're moving and you're remodeling, whatever may be the case.
What's the size of a shipping container?
There's multiple sizes and heights.
They're like 8 by 20, 8 by 40.
Yeah.
You can get 10 by 40, you can get 12 by 40.
There's
I mean,
no
you can pretty
standard.
much-
Okay,
Anything that they'll ship goods in, they'll make you a size.
so it's kind of like a drop off. I mean, they're various sizes.
Yes, yeah.
And they're just dropped off and picked up and,
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
more people are wanting to use them for storage, they put them in the backyard, and, I mean, they have a lot of benefits for storage, no doubt. They're made to be tough and carry things across the oceans and by rail, so.
They're rodent proof.
Yeah,
I mean,
they're tough.
yeah, They are.
But on the downside, you also have towns that people have them and then they don't maintain them, or different things happen, you get neighbors complaining, and we just want to get a little bit ahead of it. So the decisions to kind of make informally are, do we want to regulate shipping containers? And if so, do we want to proceed with the outright ban, or do we want to pick and choose what things we may want to regulate as far as, do we want them screened, do we want a maintenance code, an acre size, because not all lots are big enough to have one. So we kind of have two decisions to make on that front. Now, we don't have to do the final language today, Brad, just the idea still.
I think we need, I definitely think we need to examine it and set some regulations.
Okay, so maybe not do the prohibiting them, but look at the different ways to regulate them instead.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you adopted several of these, especially the acre and then the maintenance of them,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like any other structure you have at your house. I mean, you'd
Right.
expect them to keep that up, why not this?
Well, if you apply the acre one, that would pretty much eliminate everybody in town from having one.
But then if you lived in an area that had more room, it wouldn't be as big a deal because you have a lot more area. And so then, yeah, I think it would benefit those people as well.
We could even think of a reasonable sized lot, 20,000 square feet or something, if we wanted to go smaller than an acre. But obviously, these 5,000 square foot lots in town aren't gonna have room for them.
Well, this handout you gave us, this ordinance 295, is pretty restrictive, isn't it? But
Well,
just me
we
just
wouldn't-
glancing over it.
And we don't need to adopt all those, but I'm impressed that their 9 points cover so many different details. For example, one that I haven't thought about personally is to say, if we're gonna allow them, don't stack them. I mean, that should be a given, and we would say don't stack them, but this is one way of putting it in writing as well.
Yes.
You say that, but they did over in Wichita and turned them into a shopping center.
This is only for residential though.
Yeah.
That's commercial, so we're not, if you're commercial, you're welcome to use containers. In places like Wichita are also changing, or have changed theirs to say you can do containers, but, screen them, put them behind your business. You can still use them, but they're starting to put some regulations too.
I like the one where it says no human habitation in one. Cause I can see people trying that one.
Yeah, it's probably a matter of time.
See, I like number one. I like the size because I think that would cut out a lot of them.
Okay, so we'll strike the ban, and we will look at the different parts that we can regulate on here. Does that sound good to you guys? And part of this is it gives us direction which way to move next meeting, and also gives us something to report to the city commission, to let them know what direction we're moving.
So we're talking a temporary container. This or no? Are these permanent?
If we're putting the regulations, it'd be permanent,
Yeah.
with a building permit and with whatever regulations we agree on.
Yeah.
Like building a house or something, you have to follow the building codes, meet all the rules, we give you a building permit, we inspect it, it'd be the same process. You get a building permit, we inspect it, make sure it meets all the rules.
I would support the ban as well, so.
I also agree with that. I would
Alright.
as well.
But I will discuss it at length if we need to and talk about regulations, but I would certainly support that.
All right, well then, we'll continue talking about this, and I'll report back mid-February that we're moving forward with this. Now, the city commission didn't ask us to do the shipping container part, but now's as good a time as any if we're making changes to visit.
Yeah, you might as well just ask them how they wanna move forward, and, cause we don't wanna waste a bunch of time if they're not gonna agree with it anyway.
Correct.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll get feedback, so. All right, only a couple left. The point number 23, it's a pretty brief one. We had mentioned infill development, limiting that to 75 to 125% of the average on the street, so that when we have these homes demolished or burned down or whatever the case may be, we don't get the homes that are too large, as David Stewart mentioned an example last time, or similar to some of the tiny homes we have now that are just are way too small for where they are. Trying to keep the scale and context in neighborhoods in place. That's pretty common among zoning ordinances across the state and the nation. So anyways, the ordinance on this would be pretty brief. There's still some things we'd have to clarify on it. So this is more of the draft form. To give you guys a few more examples, since we asked for case studies last time, here's an example in your PowerPoint packet and on the TV screens. The left side, we got the gross floor area of the houses. In the middle, we have the average across this area. So hypothetically, we have the lot in the middle that comes vacant. Someone wants to rebuild. If we apply this rule on the right column, that means that new house would have to be somewhere in the range of 1,010 square feet to 1,683. And that gross floor area would include living areas and garage spaces. And this is one of those neighborhoods that you can see the rule would probably apply pretty well as far as a larger home would stick out quite a bit as far as and as well as a tiny home would. Let me show you two more quick examples here. This one is a slightly larger neighborhood here. We got the average floor area is a little over 1,000 square feet. So anything that has to come back in here is going to be in the 766 square foot range to 1,277 square foot range. So it's keeping them in that rough range. And lastly, one part that we would clarify before we would consider adoption of a rule like this is how we would define infill or development or redevelopment. Do we want to limit this to the older parts of town where we have homes demoed that were previously developed? The question came up, I can't remember if it was Kyle or David. They said, well, how would we apply this to newer subdivisions? Here's an example of Prairie View Road. It's a newer subdivision, still being built out. I would not call those lots that are empty redeveloped because they've never been developed. It's considered a greenfield development. So, at what point is this a neighborhood we would want this rule to apply in instead of just the infill in the bulk of town? So that's something to consider as far as how we would word it. Obviously, we wouldn't want to apply this to a new subdivision that, say, has 2 homes on one side of the street. That would definitely skew the numbers. Or do we want to put an 80% range, like, if this one street in the subdivision is 80% developed, then anything after that's considered infill, it needs to be in these ranges. As of today, you could put a tiny home right here. And that's fine.
This is all new. I mean, I see nothing in red being marked out, so this is brand new.
Yes, this would be a new section.
We're not scratching anything. This is.
Right. So we were tasked with looking into tiny homes. There's many ways to build what's considered a tiny home in town, and we discussed it a lot in November. We can do tiny home subdivisions. You can build tiny homes on lots as long as they meet our minimum building codes, as long as they meet our setbacks. So it's not that we're out to do any type of tiny home ordinance, but given the striking difference between large homes that are way too large in neighborhoods and stick out, and we've got the tiny homes that are starting to come into various neighborhoods, we just wanted to have some consistency and keep the scale and context of the neighborhoods similar. That also helps stabilize property values, which the zoning ordinance also obviously affects. So that's part of what we're looking at this. We're not looking at it as a tiny home ordinance. We're just looking at it as infill. So it is.
Is there when we said the 75 to 125%, does that count like if they have a second floor?
Yes.
Because
So
some
every
of those
city,
houses in that neighborhood do, not counting the basement they have.
so every city defines it a little bit different. Some will include basements, some don't. Some will say you're measuring it from your external walls, some it's in your internal, some it's the center line. So in our case, we would be doing the main floors and the second floors, but not the basement. So we're really looking at the sizes of the structures. That's what it is.
Not including porches.
Not including porches, no. Enclosed is the word. Enclosed structures, enclosed spaces.
There you go.
I like the way that it's written. I think it would help keep the neighborhoods more uniform, I think. Because, you could build, a lot smaller house, and that extra 25%, if you needed a bigger house, you'd still have to meet the setbacks, so, I think the way it's worded is good.
Could we always add a line on there that if they want something smaller or bigger, they could ask for a special use permit?
We could do that.
I think that would be good, and then I'd kind of cover everything, really.
Like the accessory structures, if it doesn't fit within what we've provided, then you have the option. You guys like that idea?
So outside the 75 to 125%, outside of that range, so you're talking about?
Yeah.
Sure, I can do that.
Wouldn't that be defeating the whole purpose of the 75 to 125? If you say, okay, you can get your tiny home in here, but you gotta do it under special permit.
It could lead to interesting discussions here. Now, I know that our code review board is also reviewing building code issues with tiny homes as far as how the current codes apply when you're making everything so small and meeting all your HVAC and electric and plumbing codes. And from what I hear, it's a little bit more difficult when you have a 450 square foot home. So they're also looking at if anything needs to be done on the minimum size of housing but that'd be more on their side for construction purposes and code purposes.
I think I would tend to lean more towards the 75 to 125, because I think what you say is right, that they could still come, and then, if we're gonna do that, just, I guess, leave it out, you know? Because, I mean, they could come ask for a smaller house, and, you know, I don't think there's much you could do, you know?
Those meetings, and probably depending on the neighborhood, draw plenty of neighborhood. We have heard from a number of neighbors from the existing small homes. A lot of feedback
For or against?
against.
All the above, against. And then we have two
Yeah.
tiny homes now?
Yes.
Just
Yeah.
Built?
I mean, I don't wanna speak for the people in this neighborhood, but if someone tried to build a tiny home, every one of those people would be here.
Yeah.
Because if that was my neighborhood, that's how it would go. I mean, I can
Yeah.
almost guarantee that, you know?
Yes. And for
Even
example,
too big too, though. If it's too big, we would be like, you're making my house look bad, you know?
Right. And so that with these 3 examples, we tried to get a range of homes, different ages and neighborhoods in town, try to get a good cross-section of what we have. Because El Dorado does have a broad range from sizes to years built, so pretty broad range. All right, so we'll move forward on that. Do we want to tack on the special use permit? No? Yes?
Yes.
I say no.
It's informal, I mean, just,
Is that?
we can just, we can put the language in and discuss it more next time if you guys are on the fence, since we have for and against.
I mean, right now, you don't have anything,
Right.
so this would at least give you a little bit of some regulation, and then if they wanted a variance, they could ask for it. I don't know.
We would probably have to amend our Board of Zoning Appeals article.
Or not,
To cover that.
special use permit.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Gerald, what
I
do you
don't know,
think?
I just think,
He's been really quiet the whole time. He's just kinda
Gerald?
sitting over there.
Doing a lot of reading.
You guys are in the hot
Well.
seats. Should we just discuss it more at the next meeting?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
But I think we should move forward with
I
something.
would say somewhere
So,
average.
Let's move forward with it, and we can discuss the special use permit part next time.
Okay.
Okay. So the things that we'll discuss more, then this gets us closer to having the final ordinance language too. All right, so the last change, and then we'll have a few examples, would be the side yard setback. We discussed it. In the older parts of town, anything platted before 1951, accessory structures could be built as close as 3 feet to the side yard setback line, the side property line. This one came about because we've had so many issues with existing garages. Back when the homes were designed to be centered on the lot, the driveway went up the property line, the garage was placed right on the property line. We've had a lot of issues with when they're torn down, you have to meet the new code, which is a minimum of 5 feet, even on a small lot. And so that we were discussing 3 because we've seen some other cities using it as a bare minimum to allow these people to rebuild. We certainly have plenty of people that want to keep their garages, even in really poor condition, just because they tear it down, they have to move it, and then it's not, sometimes there's driveway alignment problems. There's a number of issues that come up. So that's part of the reason that we have it in there. It's a really minor addition text-wise, and it's actually adding to a section that allows lots platted before 1951 to have some minor exemptions. One notable thing that we already apply on there is that your side yards can be from a minimum of 8 to 5 on these older lots. And another thing is that we can take the average of the front yard setbacks and reduce them below 30 feet for these older homes. So a lot of these older subdivisions that might be 15 feet back, we can take the average of all those homes when a new home is built and say, instead of applying the new 30-foot rule, we apply the 15-foot average. So it's gonna be nestled in a place that's already given these exemptions to lots of record before 1951. And to give you an idea where some of these subdivisions are, these are the years that a lot of these areas were platted. So we have a lot of the areas close to downtown in the late 1800s. So these are primarily the neighborhoods that would be affected by this rule. A lot more to the west and up further north of Random Road are all after 1950. And they do have wider lots, usually the minimum 60 feet, whereas a lot of these areas that were platted in the 1800s, early 19 are about 40 to 50 foot lots width, which is very small, very small. So is this a rule that you guys would like to move forward with?
Yes, I'm in favor of that.
I am too. I think it would encourage some of the older lots might get purchased that maybe wouldn't have because they know they could build an accessory structure.
Yeah.
You know, 1-to-1 up to
Mhm.
whatever their square footage is.
Or it might encourage some people to demolish some old structures and, so they
Mhm.
can rebuild a new one if they know they can have a 3-foot setback, so I'm
Yeah.
definitely in favor of that.
You, Kelly, you'd mentioned the ratios. A lot of these older lots, those ratios won't come into play just because the lots are so small. We're typically looking at a lot of one-car garages.
Yeah. Is there any regulation as, you know, for, you know, access to any of the utilities in the back or, you know, for like firefighters? Or, I mean, is there anything that we would be encroaching on if we moved it to that?
I mean, if there's easements in place, then this
Then you
doesn't
can do it,
apply.
right.
Right. And, yeah. It's a lot of subdivisions, the older ones will have easements in the very rear of the property. So the minimum setback for your rear right now is 8 feet, which typically covers a 16-foot easement, 8 on your property, 8 behind you. Some of them have alleyways. Typically, if they're building close to the rear, then I'll work with Scott and Josh in our engineering department to make sure there's no utilities back there. So, yeah, if there's an easement, then this 3 foot goes away.
To me, those small lots, if they don't have an alley behind them, you're gonna have trouble.
Yeah, a lot of them have the driveway up next to them.
You can't get equipment back there to repair nothing.
Have you seen the Westar guys crawl up the poles?
I just, well,
Yeah.
if you're gonna repair the sewer, or if you're gonna, anything like that.
A lot of trenchless technologies have come along in the last few years that we're able to do amazing things with pipes underground without barely even digging up anything but the surface tap with a small tiny piece of equipment, so. And it's really economical, we're not worrying about fences or sheds or other encroachments.
Other utilities?
So, trenchless technology has come
Yeah.
along.
This is maybe a little bit different, but what about a fence and a garage? Is that easement the same, setback the same for a fence and a garage?
Fences can be built in easements. You're required to call dig safe, mark the lines. Obviously, you can't put your fence on top of a water or sewer line, but you can do fences and easements, but no permanent structures.
But you can go right up to the easement with a fence?
Yeah, you can go into the easement with a fence.
Isn't it at your own risk though, that if,
At your own
Yes.
risk.
yeah, they need to work on it, your fence comes down?
It's
Yeah.
coming down, and you'll have to put it back up.
Yeah, they're not gonna take it down, you know.
And they're not gonna
piece by
take it
piece.
down?
Well, they're not gonna take it down piece by piece, I mean, it's
Oh,
coming down
They're
with
gonna
back.
come in and go
Oh, yeah.
push it over? Okay, thank you.
Okay, so what we have left is I just did a couple examples, so you guys can get a feel for some of the questions we get at our front desk here in engineering. It's on your PowerPoint on the TVs. Questions we get pretty often is, hey, I just bought a house, I'd love to build a garage or workshop behind it. What can I build? How big can I build it? So I made a few of these just to compare some of the changes we just talked about with how it exists today. For example, this right here, I drew the yellow dotted line. That would be with the correct setbacks where they could build. So going down the line, kind of this particular property was platted before 1951, so they could build as close as 3 feet. This isn't one of the ones I was mentioning earlier with the driveways next to it, with the garage behind it. As far as the max sizes go, the house is 1,048 square feet is the gross floor area, so their options would be to build a garage or workshop 1,048 square feet, or if they want to go larger, they can do a special use permit. So that's kind of how this would apply, and as you can see, this isn't exactly a large backyard. It's a typical lot size, typical house size, but as you can see, you're not going to get a 2,000 square foot accessory structure here either. So that's an example of how a common one we see. Here is, like I mentioned with the example a minute ago, where we have the driveway that goes along the side of the home, back to a garage in the back. These are the ones we have a lot of questions about. Hey, I bought a house, my garage is in poor condition, can I rebuild it? Where can I rebuild it? Same case here, size-wise. This house is 840 square feet gross floor area, so they could build an 840 square foot garage or larger by special use permit. And for a frame of reference, I put the number on there. The existing garage is 548 square feet right now. So you can get a full one car in there and a little extra storage. So that's how some of our smaller lots work. This one's 50 feet wide. And we've seen an example like this one. It's my last example, more recently down there in South Emporia. So this person has a larger house, 2,255 square feet is the gross floor area. So the yellow line would be where they could build. Part of this is assuming they purchased the empty lot next to them for the purposes of building a workshop or a detached garage. So with that much square footage, they could build the 1,200 square foot building by building permit, by right. They could build up to 1,500 square feet with those two conditions that we talked about. And the pink line shows the 60-foot setback. So if they wanted to do the 1,500 square foot, they did the matching building materials in the front, that's where the building would start. It'd be a lot further back than their current garage and a little bit behind their front door area. And then their last option would be a special use permit if they wanted to go beyond the 1,500 square feet. So just to give you a feel for how these would work and how we answer a lot of these questions. Well, that's all I have PowerPoint-wise. You guys give me enough feedback to further refine our language in here and what we need to work on and strike off. And then mid-February, Scott and I will brief the city commission, probably in a work session, about what we've discussed, what direction it's moving. Scott, is there anything that we need to tack on? Scott goes to a lot more city commission meetings, he's a little more privy to some of those conversations, so if I missed anything.
No, and I think you guys have done a great job vetting this and just knowing that every situation or condition or thing, we're not gonna be perfect, but, you know, like the progression, like the, proactive thinking, both sides of it. I mean, what can we do to better serve our citizens and the concerns we're hearing? So thank you for all your work.
I'd just like to thank Jay for putting this PowerPoint together. This help make it more easy to read and clarifies it a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, but it can get complicated if you don't look at it 8 hours a day. So at this point, I'll bring this updated stuff next week or next month. If everything looks good, then maybe we'll set a public hearing for March and get the ball rolling. Thank you, guys.
Do we have anything else for old business?
No old business.
I have something under staff.
Okay.
This is Mr. Melee here. Mealy, I apologize. And he owns a property, well, you may all know as the Moose Lodge, the old Moose Lodge property along Country Club Lane. And he thinks there's a discrepancy between what Savoy has shown and what survey he has information on. So wanted to make you all aware of that this evening. My suggestion to him is moving forward, the city commission would see this the third Monday in February, and that sooner than later, we get our heads together and get this situation resolved. And glad that he has brought this to our attention, because we do not want to plat right away. Their mayor, may not be right there, so.
Yeah.
So just wanted to make you aware of that.
So does that affect what we voted on then? I mean, if it's gonna change that, I guess?
As I feel you guys made a recommendation to the city commission, and planning commissions look at, plating as far as how it falls within the comprehensive plan, and
Well, the plating's a little bit different though. So what they approved was the plat, and then the city commission adopts the right of way and the easements. So I would say, let's keep the approval. If there's a change, then we would probably bring it back, because we'd have to approve the correct plat.
And that, okay. That was-
So if it stands, then we're good to go. If the boundaries change, then we would bring it back. Yeah, to make sure we have it correct.
But I mean, essentially, there has to be a right of way through there, right? I mean, to get to the,
this contention is, there's real property ownership there.
Sure.
Where there's an access, and what he's showed us out there is a deed that claims ownership, so we wanna make sure that all the information is correct, so.
we appreciate that.
No more
Any other
items.
staff items?
No.
Awesome. Well, if nobody else doesn't have anything, do we have a motion for adjournment?
I move we adjourn.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Meeting is adjourned.